Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 2021 TUC Disabled Workers Conference. For those of you who join us for the first time, I'm Dave Allen, and I am one of the co-chairs of the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, and I also represent disabled workers on the General Council of the TUC, where I was nominated by my trade union Unite and was elected by and I'm accountable to the Congress of the TUC. Other colleagues of ours on the committee, the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, will be chairing later sessions of the conference. This afternoon, we will be starting conference with speeches from Vicky Foxcroft, the Shadow Disabled Minister, Rachel O'Brien, the Unite Rep at the Inclusion London and an Independent Living Campaigns Officer, and finally, but by no means least, our colleague Gil Cartmill, who was this year's president of the TUC. Could everyone please note that we have a hashtag for the conference. If you're tweeting, it is hashtag uppercase TUCD, lowercase disability. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, my comrade, and my friend, Vicky Foxcroft, an ex-Unite officer, and currently Shadow Minister for Disabled People and the MP for Lewisham. Vicky.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. Can I start by saying how excited I am to join your conference? Having worked for a trade union for many years before becoming an MP, I know the amazing work you do day in, day out, defending your members and recruiting new members to ensure workers' voices are heard loud and clear by employers, government, and anyone else who seeks to attack their rights. As a proud trade unionist, I was delighted when Keir asked me to take on the role of Shadow Minister for Disabled People last April. I'm not going to lie, it's been a bit daunting at times, but I have had the honour of meeting some of the most passionate and talented people of my life. Today, Labour have launched their campaign for the local elections, mayoral elections, Scottish and Welsh elections, all across the country. For the last 10 years, we have had a government which was desperately underfunded and cut the resources for local government. We know the impact this has had on disabled people, often struggling to ensure their support packages are properly resourced, making it harder to live fulfilling and rewarding lives. We need to ensure we have those Labour representatives fighting our corner, working with us to ensure that when the government talks about building back better, we actually do build back better with greater equality for all. We need to ensure there is no back to normal for disabled people who prior to this pandemic already felt like an afterthought. This pandemic has shone a light on the inequalities that continue to impact disabled people's lives, and we must demand better. Too many times you will have heard this. Too many reports have highlighted this. But too little change has happened. And heartbreakingly, disabled people have accounted for 60% of COVID deaths. And the worrying truth is that a lot of these deaths were potentially preventable. Too many disabled people have had do not resuscitate notices on their medical records without proper consultation. And time and again, when this has been highlighted, guidance has been issued to say this shouldn't be happening. So why does this keep happening? It has to stop. We must demand it stops. During this pandemic, we've seen too many disabled people struggle to access essentials like food, medicines, and PPE equipment. And when I say to you today, poor accessibility of communications from government, you will know exactly what I mean. But 1 year on, it has not been sorted. How much longer do they need? And I cannot tell you how many times I've asked the Prime Minister about British Sign Language interpretation at their press conferences. And each time he says, Point noted. No, Boris, I don't want you to note it. I want you to sort it. Let's note the difference with Labour. When Keir had our campaign launch today, what did he do? Of course, he outlined a better vision for this country. He did it with BSL interpretation. But let me focus on some positives that have come out of the pandemic. As other speakers have no doubt highlighted, disabled people have for years been told they couldn't work from home when they requested this. Overnight, when everyone had to work from home, this was then able to happen. And when we talk about building back better with a more inclusive society, this is what we're talking about. Keep home working for those it works for. And on technology, we've seen companies like Zoom, Microsoft, and others make improvements to their accessibility of their programs that were 10 years down the line, delivered in rapid time. This investment in inclusive technology needs to continue. But for too many, we know there is digital exclusion. We have to support those who don't have the skills or knowledge, and we need to support those who don't have access to the devices. And this shouldn't just be a COVID thing. And this is what I'm talking about when we say build back better and building a more inclusive society. Digital inclusion, not exclusion. The latest ONS figures show the disability employment gap standing at 28.6%. And there is a very real risk this could rise as we come out of the pandemic, with a citizens' advice report suggesting that 1 in 4 disabled people are facing redundancy. We want to reduce the disability employment gap, not increase it. And shockingly, disabled workers earn 20% less. And in current trends, this is unlikely to be reversed. I welcome the TUC's campaign for mandatory reporting on the disability pay gap, something I know some companies are doing. All companies should adopt this. As trade unionists, we all recognise the role you can play in securing reasonable adjustments for those that need it in the workplace. This can be a hard-fought battle at times, and often when an employee moves on, you have to begin the cycle of fighting for these again. As a TUC and GMB campaign for a reasonable adjustment passport highlights, there are simpler, less draining solutions out there. And these solutions need to make it easier to be able to get access to work. Currently, only 23% of disabled people in employment use this scheme. And that means only 39,060 adults have access to this support. And those that do access it often say to me that knowledge of the scheme, paperwork involved, and timelines of support are all issues. And this leads me to my final point. We want to work with you to ensure we get that future Labour government. And this is why we'll be doing virtual roadshows up and down the country, working with disabled people's organisations, disabled people, disabled trade unionists, and others to ensure we get this right, so that we have a winning manifesto that has a more equal and inclusive society at its centre. I will also be working with all of my frontbench colleagues to ensure disabled people are at the heart of all of our discussions. We know many were happy with the last manifesto for disabled people. I want you to know we will build on this. We can be bolder. Working together, anything is possible. And I just want to finish with a little secret I'm going to share with you. I don't want to be the shadow minister for disabled people. I want to be the minister for disabled people. I want to work with you to make this happen. Thank you for having me along today.
Thank you so much for that, Vicky. And not only do you want to be the Minister for Disabled People, we want you, a committed trade unionist, to be the Minister for Disabled People. And can I just say, on behalf of the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, We worked with your predecessors on that 2015 general election manifesto, and there's already an awful lot of information being collected. And we hope that we can work together and build a manifesto not as good, but better, because that was done at very short notice. So hopefully for the next general election, which is going to result in you being the Minister for the Disabled, that we can have an even better manifesto. And solidarity, Vicky, and thank you so much. Can I now introduce our second speaker? Rachel O'Brien is a colleague of mine. We work together in ROFA and on the NILS subcommittee, and we've just set up a trade union subcommittee of the NILS subcommittee. So Rachel works for Inclusion London, where she is a trade union rep and is extremely knowledgeable about disabled issues. Rachel.
Hi comrades, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. As a young disabled trade unionist and workplace rep, it's amazing to be amongst you all at the Disabled Workers Conference. My name is Rachel O'Brien and I am a Policy and Public Affairs Officer at Inclusion London. Inclusion London is a London-wide second-tier deaf and disabled people's organisation, although we also do quite a lot of national work, particularly in our policy and campaigns. We have been working seemingly endlessly during the pandemic to lobby the government and other bodies to protect the rights of disabled people during the pandemic and to try and remove the easements in the Coronavirus Act that endanger disabled people's rights to social care and education. One of the main areas we've been working on alongside our colleagues in the trade union movement has been the rights of disabled workers. It's been long documented that disabled people face discrimination in the workplace, in recruitment and in career progression. The pandemic has made these disparities between disabled workers and their non-disabled peers even more stark. Research from Citizens Advice has shown that between 27 and 37% of disabled people were facing redundancy during the pandemic, although shielding that raised to half. These numbers are horrifying and demonstrate that the desperately needed work must be done by trade unions, the government and employers in tackling the disability discrimination in the workplace. This approach must be multi-pronged and must address the barriers to getting into the workplace in the first case, as well as the enforcement of reasonable adjustments once disabled people are in the workplace. The pandemic has illustrated that reasonable adjustments that were once a pipe dream for disabled people, dismissed by employers as not possible or realistic, are in fact both possible and necessary. The move to remote working has greatly benefited many disabled workers and offered up the job market to many of those who would have been excluded from the traditional workplace. But it would be naive to think that working from home is a good solution for all, and it would be a mistake to think that this has not been another way for employers to discriminate against their disabled employees. Inclusion London has run a national survey asking disabled people about their experiences during the pandemic. And on the theme of work, their responses were very grim. We heard stories of disabled workers being forced to use statutory sick pay, annual leave and unpaid leave, rather than being furloughed or their job descriptions being slightly changed so they could do their jobs from home. We heard of disabled people that were working from home, but access to work took too long or was too inflexible to provide the support they needed in a new working environment, so they lost their jobs. We have heard stories of disabled workers at increased risk to coronavirus who cannot work from home being forced into work with the threat of redundancy. So they have had to choose between their livelihoods and their lives. This is, of course, all highly racialized and gendered. The case of Belly Majinga being just one tragic example of employers and the government's absolute failure to protect those most at risk of dying during the pandemic. Disabled people are also overrepresented in insecure work on 0 hours contracts in sectors known to be particularly hostile to workers' rights and lax on workplace safety. So whilst I am here to talk about reasonable adjustments, I'm also here to make the point that you can't truly effectively make reasonable adjustments within the system of work that the UK currently has. We can't just tinker around the edges. We need transformational change in how work works. This means an end to 0 hours contracts where we're asking for a reasonable adjustment could just end up in a worker not getting any more hours. This means sick pay that someone can actually live on, so they don't have to go to work when they are not well. This means mandatory offers of furlough to all workers who are at increased risk of serious illness due to COVID, those that live with them, and people with other caring responsibilities. These are all things which go beyond the traditional purview of reasonable adjustments, but they are all things that must be tackled if we want reasonable adjustments to be at all effective and to be enforceable. So on to reasonable adjustments. It is a duty in the Equality Act that employers must provide their disabled employees with reasonable adjustments in order for them to be able to carry out their jobs on an equitable basis to their non-disabled peers. Some examples of reasonable adjustments could be something as small as providing materials on a different coloured paper, to bigger things like the rewriting of job descriptions to remove certain tasks that someone may not be able to do for impairment-related reasons. Flexible working, so this includes both the hours and the location of work, are also reasonable adjustments. The concept of reasonable adjustments is a good one, if not one that is limited by the larger working conditions in the UK, as I mentioned before. The real issue comes down to the enforcement of reasonable adjustments. The Equality Act is ultimately completely toothless. It relies on individual disabled people who've been discriminated against taking a case against, in this instance, their employer. For most disabled workers, this is not possible due to the associated costs and risks this poses to them. For those that do take their employers to court, most of the time they will not be able to go back to their jobs, even if they receive financial compensation of some kind. There must be a national regulator and enforcement of reasonable adjustments that does not rely on individual disabled people taking legal action. Ideally, this would be for a body like the Equality and Human Rights Commission. However, the situation with the EHRC is not an ideal one, with it being explicitly admitted recently that Liz Truss is packing it with people of her own particular ideology. So whilst our long-term goals must involve public bodies, national equalities institutions and demands on the government, in the shorter term, trade union organising in workplaces has never been so important for the health, safety and equality of disabled workers. An injury to one is an injury to all in the workplace, and when our colleagues are being targeted based on their circumstances or identity, it is now more important than ever that we stand in solidarity with one another. This is a fundamental principle of our movement, but it's also a practical one. They may start with attacks on one group of workers, but it never just stops there. For the future, we need a government that puts the rights of workers and disabled people at the heart of what they do. A good start to this would be reforming the Equality Act so it is fit for use. But it must be made equally clear that any reforming of the Equality Act must not be used as an excuse to further oppress and marginalise our transgender comrades even further. Changes to the Equality Act must be made to benefit the most marginalised amongst us and ensure that the rights of all are enforceable. We need mandatory pay and employment gap reporting. The employment rate for disabled people in 2020 was 53.7%, a gap of 28% with non-disabled people. This gap massively increases when you look specifically at the employment rates of disabled women and disabled people of colour. But it's not enough to mind the gap. The gap must be acted upon. Inclusion London absolutely agrees with our colleagues in the TUC who back action plans to address pay and employment gaps, and we too agree that these plans must be made by the employer in partnership with a workplace trade union. I'm going to stop here because I'm aware I've just said a lot, but I think the important points to take from this are the need for strong workplace unions, the enforcement of reasonable adjustments with the monitoring and transparency to do this, and the need for government to introduce and strengthen legislation to improve workplace conditions for all. Thank you so much for inviting and listening to me this afternoon.
I know I'm unmuted and I have lost my someone's unmuted me. Right, thanks very much for that, Rachel. A really inspiring contribution. Some excellent information and material in there, and stimulating as well. Our next contribution is from another friend, colleague and sister of mine, who is this year's president of the TUC, Sister Gil Cartmill. I've known Gil for many years. I don't know if she remembers when I knew her many years ago in a print shop, which is very heavily involved in the labour movement. But Gil is an Assistant General Secretary of Unite, an excellent trade unionist, a very formidable negotiator on behalf of our members. So I now welcome the President of the TUC, Gil Cartmill.
Thank you very much, Dave. And of course, I remember you, comrade. We go back many, many years. Thank you all for finding a space for me to bring you the solidarity of the TUC as its president this year, but also to bring my personal solidarity as a friend. And by the way, I'm told that there may be people who are participants in this afternoon's activities who are not yet a member of a trade union. So can I say very early on that if you're not a member of the trade union, please join us. Honestly, we're not full up and it really is a case of the more the merrier. I know that you've already talked about how the pandemic has shone a light on structural discrimination, discrimination across politics, society, and at work. And I think what we all know is that structural discrimination is the lived experience of disabled workers. And the data speaks volumes. Disabled men, 6.5 times more likely to die from COVID, and for disabled women, this rises to a staggering 11.3 times higher compared with a woman who is not disabled. And yet I think what we've all seen is that getting focus on remedies remains a massive uphill struggle. As trade unionists, we know very well that political, societal, and workplace campaigns are intrinsically linked. Change for the better has to be holistic. Better law, better services, and rights at work have to dovetail, because one without the other simply will not work. So we as trade unionists need to take a long, hard look at this data. For an example, an incredible rate of 62% higher redundancy levels, another staggering statistic, and TUC research shows one of the most common issues reps deal with at work is disability discrimination. The conference reminds us all, though, that we need to check that our toolbox for tackling workplace disability discrimination is really up to scratch. And in my view, that means looking again at our policies, reps training, and importantly, to ensure that our structures are genuinely inclusive. We're challenged, I believe, to recheck our collective agreements, noting the disability employment gap is 30% and the pay gap is 20%. Both those, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic that I mentioned previously. And it is the case that all those reps that are working on individual cases of disability discrimination are really seeing the red flag. One case is usually the symptom of organisational failure, and that's something we can't afford to forget. And that includes the failure to put in place reasonable adjustments. I was very struck by what Rachel just mentioned regarding the potential for action plans. Of course, an employer action plan, but an action plan has to include the participation, wisdom, and representation of the workplace trade union, because it will be all the better for it. And so I promise not to speak for very long, Dave. So I'm just going to conclude with a heartfelt message to you. Keep up the fight. You inspire, you educate, you lead, and importantly, critically, you hold our movement's feet to the fire. So thank you all for listening, and thank you all very much indeed from the bottom of my heart for all that you do. Solidarity, comrades.
And solidarity to you as well, Gil.